everyone, I'm Megan Thomas, and today I'm chatting with Lauren Goldstein Crowe. Lauren is the author of the Isabella Blow biography, of a business fashion book about Jimmy Choo, and of a photography book called 50 Shades. It's about sunglasses before anyone gets too excited. Today, I'm going to chat to Lauren and really unpack this 20-year career she's had in fashion journalism and writing. She's covered fashion for Times Magazine, Fortune, Condé Nast, the Financial Times, and more. Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Hi, Megan. I'm good. Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I suppose the main thing I'm keen to talk to you about is your career in fashion, but a nice place to start would actually be your interest in fashion and where that started. Has that been something you've always been passionate about?
No, actually. I started on a website with Women's Wear Daily doing consumer stuff. So editing a section about celebrities and about models. And it was really more the gossipy end. And in 1998, Donna Karan was having an IPO, which was sort of one of the first big fashion IPOs. And Fortune was looking for somebody to start covering this, sort of a new sector, because they'd all been family-run companies before. And I had this sort of unique background where I wasn't afraid to talk to men in suits. And I also, by now, had been doing the fashion shows and, getting to know the lay of the land. So I sort of talked my way into this job that now I would probably never get because now there's a lot of people cover. I think they're even doing MAs in the business of fashion. But at that point, it was, if you weren't afraid to talk to business people or and you could make out the basics of an annual report, that was kind of all it took. It wasn't a super complicated business the way, say, tech was, which was the other big topic of that time.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it seems like something that you cover quite extensively in your Jimmy Choo book, because that's really about just how much business goes into these kinds of brands and these big names, because I personally had no idea there was so much business involved in making a brand as successful as the big ones are.
Well, Jimmy Choo was really the first brand created by a business team. Everything else sort of evolved. So they were all family-run businesses, small businesses that had been around for hundreds of years, and now they're publicly traded. Now they're big businesses. But at that time, the guy who had been CEO of oh God, where had Robert been? One of these long-term CEOs, he'd been working in LVMH for a long time, saw an opportunity to build something that was really minuscule and just start at the ground floor and build it the way a serious business would be built.
Yeah, it is a towering world, as the book's aptly titled. So knowing what you know now about that starting point and how you made it, is there anything you would have done differently, or do you think that you did all the right things at the time?
Well, I would tell journalists or people who want to be journalists that, it is good to figure out what you want to write about before you launch your career, because I think particularly today, there's so many people, everyone's kind of a journalist if you think about how much accessibility there is with the internet. So being an expert, having a niche is definitely a way to get a leg up. I mean, pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world and how that relates to what your niche area is. But I think, it's very hard to replicate the depth of knowledge that I had now. And so the more you can do when you're sort of coming up to make sure you know what you're talking about and not just having the ability to talk is really important.
Yeah, and the ability to go past just being interested in fashion. Although is that something that's you've got to be not interested, fashionable is what I mean. Was there a point where that changed, where kind of everyone was wearing their stilettos to the office, or was there a point where it was quite business?
No, I mean, well, I was always, in terms of what I did every day, I was quite isolated because I was the only they were Time Magazine, they were covering wars, and 9/11 happened while I was at Time Magazine. But then I would have to go out into the field, to do my reporting. I would go to the shows. So I was surrounded very much with the fashion crowd. It was just in my own office. I would come back and write about it for a general interest audience. And I sort of gravitated to the other people who were the only person on the staff of a general interest paper. So, all of the newspapers have somebody covering fashion. They don't have massive teams, whereas all of the magazines would send massive teams of people. But yeah, I mean, I think I was always into journalism mostly because of the characters. And at some point I had a choice between working on a sports magazine for women or taking a job covering fashion. And I thought, well, I like playing sports, but I think, in terms of travel and meeting people and seeing things, that fashion is going to be a sort of fruitful area to cover. So I sort of made that
Yeah.
decision.
And so then you weren't always writing long form pieces. So was transitioning into the books harder, or was it kind of more like writing long form journalism, then a separate entity in its own right?
No, the books were terrifying. And I mean, to be honest, I didn't want to do them. Barbara and I were, she was starting up a private equity company, and I had just given birth to twins and was sort of helping out on admin stuff, basically to get away from my kids for a little while. And she said, I think we should write this book. I thought, she's like, I've always wanted to write a book. I said, baby, I have never wanted to write a book. 250 words, 1,000 words. That was sort of my sweet spot. So it was daunting, but when you sit down to do it, you just, particularly nonfiction, I think nonfiction is in many ways easier because you just break it into chapters, and one of my editors at Fortune said chronology is your friend. So if you're not trying to do anything too tricksy, it's about the reporting, and it's, if every chapter is sort of an article, and then you try to get them to link together. But like any big problem, you turn it into smaller problems and take them one at a time.
Yeah, that process does sound tricky, and especially when you're co-writing. Did you find that to split things up in terms of you chapter, I'll do the other, or was it a constant collaborative endeavor?
The way we envisioned it was that we would do most of the interviews together. So we would go and talk to people at the same time. And that when it came down to writing the chapters, if it was a very business, we have some, the history of the luxury goods sector and the chapters, anything that was very finance, she would do. Then a luxury goods analyst at JP Morgan. She'd been one of my sources when I was working at Time. And that I would write, the rest of the book. And it was always also envisioned that because this was my full-time job and she was still working on this other fund, that I would be doing the bulk of the work. And then we would just swap and sort of edit each other's chapters before we delivered it.
That's so interesting to hear, because it really reads like one mind has written the whole thing. So that's a feat to have accomplished. Then when you started writing it, Isabella Blow, by yourself, was that a totally different experience?
Yeah, I mean, the hardest thing with that is it can be quite lonely. You spend a lot of time after you finish the reporting, which, when you're reporting, of course, you're out talking to people. But when you have to finally just sit and be alone in your head, trying to keep track of, where the story's going, that was quite difficult. And particularly with Isabella, because everybody sort of had stories, but they couldn't remember what year, which event, but they could always remember what she was wearing. So I sort of, at the end, I had to go through all of the paparazzi photos that are available on Getty and the rest of those agencies to get the dates and figure out where she was. Like if she was in the lobster hat, then I knew it was this event. If she was wearing, the chainmail headdress, then I knew it was that event. And that's how I sort of was able to get the backbone of a timeline to help people fill in their own memories about what happened when.
Yeah, and it seems like
a lot of people.
Yeah, it seems like Isabella was quite a storyteller. So there were at least 3 or 4 versions of everything that was happening based on who she was telling and when she was telling it.
Yes, that's the other thing. She wasn't necessarily the most reliable narrator.
Yeah. Had you ever met her?
I met her, when I was pregnant with twins. I met her a couple of times, but I remember this very distinctly. I sat down, it was like 10 o'clock in the morning, and was sitting in the front row of a fashion show, and she sat down next to me and she said, I need a man. I'm getting divorced and I'm not very good on my own. Do you know anyone? And I was like, no. Who is she going to date? Because she was so unusual. It's like, who could I set her up with? And then when I was reporting the book, I realized, wow, she actually dated quite a lot. There were a lot of men that really like her sort of quirky personality and how much fun she was.
And so which is your favorite to write? Or is that like making you choose a child?
I mean, I think when I read them now, I think Isabella Blow is the better book, probably because I'd been through the process before. When we did Jimmy Choo and we submitted it, I sort of thought it was going to go through several rounds of editing the way everything that I wrote at Time Magazine had gone through. And it really isn't the case with books, that you sort of get a once over and then it's printed. It's like, wait. Uh, they were both interesting in different ways. I mean, like I said, the reporting is always really interesting, and there was a lot of trust level, trust issues with the Isabella Blow book. People didn't understand why I was writing the book if I hadn't been a close friend with her. So I had to sort of explain to people why I wanted to tell the story and how I was going to tell the story. Her husband was doing a book at the same time, which I think actually helped me in the end, because a lot of people did not want his book to be the only book out there about her, because it was such a one-sided take on, what happened towards the end of her life. But yeah, that was, whereas Sagra already had a lot of connections that would have been much harder to get to in the Jimmy Choo book. All those sort of banking people can be quite secretive, so that was easier in terms of access because they knew her and they'd worked on deals with her before, and there was an implicit trust level there. That yeah, that wasn't necessarily there with the same cast of characters on the other book.
Yeah, and I suppose the Isabella Blow book is so much more. It's about a person rather than a brand, so it becomes more personal for the people talking about her, especially if she was their friend.
Yeah, and because she was dead, and there was a lot of emotion, and because I hadn't known her, it was you have to be sympathetic and very sensitive to the fact that you're not just telling a story, that it is somebody's sister and somebody's best friend, and that was a big responsibility. But when it came out, I think I definitely annoyed people when I was doing it. But when it came out, Philip Tracy, who spent a lot of time with me for the book, was just, I think, very grateful and said, "You wrote the most beautiful book." So I think that they were all pleased that they did it at the end, because now there is sort of, a memoir that they're proud of about the friend that they lost.
Yeah, and it really does give the proper scope of her life, which I imagine Detmar's book probably wouldn't. Not that I've read it, not to be too judgmental, but their relationship was a dynamic one.
Yes.
So then 50 Shades came after that. That came in 2012. I think first off, can you tell me whether that's an intentional reference to 50 Shades of Grey?
I mean, I had been trying at that point. I had a friend who the Somerset House, and I had this idea to do the history of sunglasses as seen on the faces that wore them, and had been talking with Getty about getting photographs throughout the ages of famous people in sunglasses. And we approached a publisher that he knew, and the guy said, "I'll do it, but you can only have 50." So he definitely wanted that to be the marketing angle for it. Yeah. And it was a great idea. And yeah, when I started to write it, I was, the history of sunglasses is such that nothing was branded in the 50s. There was one guy in Camden Market who's very knowledgeable, and you could tell by the number of screws whether it was Ray-Ban or a fake Ray-Ban. And I just at the end thought, if I don't care, probably most people don't care. So I turned it into a book about sort of what the sunglasses say about who you are. Celebrities wear them to sort of hide the fact that they're famous people, and we wear them to try to look like we're famous people. But I just tried to get quotes about them, talking about, Robert De Niro's quote was, "I'm so shy, I must never leave the house without my sunglasses on."
And that element of secrecy is so interesting.
Yeah.
I'd actually love now to go more into the industry itself and who is wearing the clothes, these luxury clothes, because it's so influential to who then buys them. And it felt to me like reading The Towering World of Jimmy Choo that they were kind of the first people to really get in on that influencer power. The first people to kind of put shoes onto famous feet, and for that to be a PR. Do you think that that's kind of testimony to Tamara Yerdai's savviness? Because traditionally, with brands, for instance, like Manolo Blahnik, he would not put shoes on people who hadn't bought them. And that transition phase, what do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, In Style magazine launched in the mid 1990s. And I think that was the sort of moment when people started to realize the power of celebrities in terms of making purchasing decisions. In the 50s and the 60s, when you went to the Oscars, people just dressed themselves. Brands were not spending millions of dollars trying to get one girl into one dress. We didn't call them influencers then, because the influencers today, they're not celebrities. They made themselves celebrities, but the Kardashians are a product of Instagram. They weren't, celebrities in the sort of grand screen darlings of the years past. Um, so I think in terms of like the Instagram influencer, I wouldn't say that Jimmy Choo was the first to do that, but I think that they were, particularly in footwear, very early to realize like, yeah, we need to get our shoes, just because it's a dress and the dress might even cover the shoes, this credit is still going to say shoes by Jimmy Choo. And, making sure that the pictures were full length so that you could see the shoes. And then they sort of lucked out in some ways, like getting themselves onto Sex and the City and then being mentioned in exactly the same breath as Gucci. Then suddenly, these brands, which took hundreds of years to develop their reputation, they were on a par with right away. How much that matters these days is kind of an interesting question, because I don't feel like the fashion brands have quite the same ubiquitousness that they did before. I think people are sort of looking for younger, newer talents. And the brands have sort of exhausted themselves by trying to churn out all of these collections after collections after collections. I think, yeah, with COVID, I think everyone's got a bit of exhaustion about fashion and clothes and materialism and shopping in general. So it's an interesting time to see what these brands, which just wanted to grow, are going to do next when people are thinking, about what they really need and about the planet more and more. And yes, how many things we do actually need.
Yes, and the fast fashion seems to be on its way out in terms of people realizing what the implications are on the environment. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think the influence of high street fashion and people being able to be quite fashionable without having to buy these high-end brands, what that means for the luxury sphere, or whether it'll kind of always survive.
I think Depop is a really interesting phenomenon. That's where my daughter buys all of her clothes. Like everything is bought secondhand. And it's modeled on the girls that owned it before they wanted to sell it. So that's sort of, yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be like the trendy eBay.
Yeah, I guess it's a much younger eBay. I haven't spent much time on it myself, but I think that's an encouraging sign. I feel like I'm a bit removed from it to know, just really speak very clearly about what their plans are. I know that Hermes was one of the companies that sort of defied lockdown, and the stock was still improving, but a lot of their business is based on these two handbags and the hoops that they make women jump through in order to get the bags. So they're very dependent on a sort of core group of products. And if that core group of products were to become not trendy anymore, who knows what would happen to that business?
Yeah. And do you think that the fashion industry is as glamorous within as it looks from the outside? In terms of socially and also just the lifestyles that people are leading within the industry?
It was a lot of fun. I mean, it's a nice place to work. You're surrounded by, and again, I was a journalist, so I didn't necessarily see it. I wasn't inside the sausage machine, and there was a lot of pressure on designers, and we saw a lot of them breaking down, including, McQueen, and a lot of it. So I think it is a very different position. And there was a lot of griping about the superficial, or, the sort of schedule that they had people on, turning out so many collections and journalists having to cover so many collections. But it wasn't like covering Bosnia. It's all in perspective. You're still like, you're covering fashion shows, and you're drinking champagne, and you're in beautiful palaces and beautiful places. It is a pretty interesting life. Is it fulfilling after 10 years? It depends on who you are, I think, and how strong your home life is. Susie Manx was very clear that she wanted to champion young designers, and she goes out of her way to make sure she was doing as much as she could to support young designers. I really think, that the industry needs to be rejigged a bit to make sure that it's easier for kids who have a design ability to get paying jobs, and not just be sort of held up as like one is a star or another is a star. But like any sort of creative profession, it's hard to mix the commerce with the art.
Yeah, and you do talk in Isabella Blow about how some people have suggested that you can blame the fashion industry for Alexander McQueen or Isabella Blow's suicides, where you say that you don't believe that's the case. And do you want to elaborate a little bit more on why that?
I mean, my father was a psychologist. He didn't see patients, but he was involved in funding studies. So I always come at mental illness as mental illness is mental illness. So you take somebody else and you put them in the same set of circumstances, that person isn't going to necessarily react the way, it's not like it's going to drive anybody suicidal. McQueen, I think, had been suicidal for a long time. There was an interview in The Guardian where his mother said, "What are you most afraid of?" And he said, "Dying before you do." And when I heard that, I thought he committed suicide shortly after his mother died. And I thought he was really just waiting because he loved his mother and he didn't want to hurt her. With Isabella, her decline was such that, it seemed like she had a very high need for attention from a very young age. And when the clothes stopped getting her the attention, and as, everybody reaching middle age sort of struggles for their role in the world. And she just found it really hard. And it was put on a cocktail of drugs that may have exacerbated her condition. But she tried several times, and each time she'd get more attention. And I think that, when you're truly, truly suicidal, you don't try several times. I think that was sort of a cry for help from her. Yeah, I mean, fashion can be a tough industry, I guess, if you don't have the stomach for it. But then a lot of people would just leave, perhaps, and try to find something else to do. They wouldn't necessarily keep working, or a toxic workplace environment. If these people had the ability to sort of create different realities. They weren't, the poorest of the poor working in garment factories. I don't think that it necessarily means that has to end the way that it did. Yes, it's stressful, but they do have options.
Yeah. And I'm interested to talk a little bit about your thoughts on the role of class within the industry, because it did seem like a lot of Isabella's successes would come because she knew a princess or went to school with a very aristocratic model who saved the day for a photo shoot, and what you think the value of those connections were for her success.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because McQueen was very working class and Isabella was very upper class, and that is the sort of that seems to be the magic combination. Nobody in the middle would be considered cool. Isabella was the first one to sort of bring those models. Didn't used to be aristocratic. Well, they were sort of Tatler features, but it would have been seen not to be the thing to do to pose for a photo shoot. They would be in the pages of Tatler if they attended an event, but this is very different. And so she sort of heralded in the cool aristo models. But then at the other side of the spectrum, like the true talent seemed to come bubbling up from the bottom, the same as it used to be in music and in art. It was the working classes that seemed to be the ones that would be the creative impulse, and then be elected by the people at the top of the pyramid in terms of class or in terms of money. It's very much, that's very much, I think, a UK phenomenon. I couldn't really speak to what happens in other European countries. And in the States, it seems to be like everything sort of more egalitarian. But certainly the UK has this long tradition of the working class sort of being the ones providing the design talent, as it were, or the interesting ideas. And well, at least, not talking about haute couture, but yeah, from the sort of 60s onward, it was sort of more of a political movement and things. People like Vivienne Westwood and Catherine Hamnett were not deemed posh. They did not come from posh families.
And certainly with Jimmy Choo, kind of in his little warehouse in Hackney, or how Alexander McQueen insists that he's a tradesman who makes hats rather than someone within the fashion industry.
Cobbler is what. Yeah, I mean, he was an immigrant. He was literally taught to put shoes together, and then his niece was the one who'd gone to design school and was sort of, trying to get him to be more fashion forward. And Tamara was the one who sort of encouraged him to build that out and make it a proper business, which terrified him. He was really afraid of all of her plans to go to America, and that's why they eventually bought him out. Yeah.
Do you think he was treated badly at all? I'm not sure. I
don't think he would have. He was bought out for £10 million, and I don't think he was going to turn that into a £10 million company on his own. Could it have been handled better? I'm not sure. I mean, he's still alive. He still has, as far as I know, he still has a shop where he's making couture shoes for women. He's still got his clientele. They took him places that he probably wasn't going to get to if she hadn't turned up on the scene. That doesn't mean that, I can say that from afar. It doesn't mean that it wasn't a deeply painful thing for him to have to go through. But I don't think I think in some ways it's sort of that that she's been treated a bit unfairly when they portray like that she stole the company from him. She didn't, she was trying to build it with him. And when it was clear that he wasn't able to really do what she needed him to do, then yes, they bought him out. But like I said, that was 10 million pounds that I just don't see him getting there on his own.
Yeah. And these big fashion names do seem to be very much in need of a strong business mind. The creatives are really important, but if you want to grow it to the size that Jimmy Choo grew,
that's always been the real problem. And historically, it was always lovers. It was Pierre Berger built Yves Saint Laurent with Saint Laurent. All of these men had sort of a lover who would take that role, because at the time, as a business job, it wasn't great. There wasn't tons of money. If you had just a business mind, you'd go into, Procter and Gamble or something that was a much bigger business. So it almost was a labor of love. And then, we saw the rise of the professional manager when the Gucci's wanted to sell the company. Then you see professional managers come in because it's a multi-million-dollar business and they're shareholders, and you can't really just have somebody, a close family friend running the company for you at that point. But they didn't really exist. It was almost always somebody who was doing it as a labor of love up until, the time when I started covering it. I mean, even Donna Karan, her husband, was responsible for a lot of her initial business development.
You must have just spoken to the most fascinating people in your interviewing processes and your research. Who is your favorite to talk to, or the most interesting?
Well, I mean, Tom Ford is a great interview. He's got such a sharp mind. He speaks so fast, and he's just really, really funny. So he was definitely, in terms of sort of people I got to know, definitely one that was always, he's like, we tried to do furniture, Lauren, but if you want to talk about sales per square foot, it's jewelry, just little gems like that. Valentino was also just, he wasn't necessarily trying to be funny, but he was very funny because he would just come out with these, the things I have seen, the women with the not wearing the tights in front of the Ritz in the middle of February with the blue legs, and he was truly horrified by that sight. It was sort of funny for different reasons. But yeah, I mean, when InStyle did first launch, I was sent to cover parties for them. And that was, even just getting a sound bite from Keith Richards. I said, what brings you out this evening? And he said, I don't even know where I am. Like, you couldn't make it up. So it's been fun. I mean, if you read the intro to the book, at that same age, when I was covering these parties for InStyle, I tried to interview Richard Gere, the Metropolitan Museum of Art Costume Institute Gala, which is, notoriously the most ostentatious party of the year. And I said to him, what brings you out this evening? It's InStyle. These questions are not difficult. It's a charity function. And he said, I should have left my sunglasses on. I was like, dude, just stay home. If you don't want to talk to the press, you don't come to a party like this.
And now I understand with those kind of events, you would have been interviewing someone to then write up an article afterwards. But when you were doing your interview for your books, did you have all the interviews done first before you started writing, or were you kind of dipping into both as you did your research?
No, I really tried to do all the interviews before I sat down to write. I mean, I'm sure there were exceptions where people I wanted to speak to wouldn't speak to me until later in the game when they found out that other people had been speaking to me. But I don't really see how you can tell the story until you know where it begins and where it ends. I think other writers, a friend of mine does it differently and will write, the chapters as he finishes them. But I didn't report it chronologically. I reported it in terms of who I was able to get, soonest. So in Isabella's case, obviously the people who were willing to talk to me first were the people in the business that I knew before. And had sort of known her when she was working in fashion. And then they had become friends with her family over the course of the years that they knew and worked with her. So then they would help make introductions to even Detmar's mother, her husband's mother, who finally reached out to me, those people would have been much harder if it was just a cold call. Like, Isabella's mother never did speak to me, but, would Isabella's sisters have spoken to me if I just called them out of the blue saying, I want to write a book about your sister? They probably would have said no. But when Philip said, look, this is an important book and we don't want Detmar's to be the only book on the market, then they sort of came around because he was able to help facilitate those things. So I couldn't, even if I'd wanted to report it in a logical way, I couldn't really. I had to sort of piece it all together, unpick it, and then re-put it back together, and then see what the story looked like by the time I finished it. And I really didn't know because I hadn't done, most of the people I interviewed in my career were not the creatives. They were mostly the CEOs and the chairmen of the board. So it was the first time I was really going in to talk to the other sort of creative people about somebody and about these things. And so that was sort of new to me, talking. I always say, like, I'm not the kind of journalist that sees social change in a headline. It's like the business means that there's a there there, and you can talk about what's selling and what your plans are and what's working, what's not. But to write, the sort of general, what it all means when you see something come down a catwalk wasn't really my strength. And Isabella was, the sort of opposite end to the business side of this business. She was the pure creative spirit. So that was sort of an interesting journey for me to take. And like anything that you're sort of afraid of when you start out, it's really not that hard. There was always, why would somebody dress the way she did? And people would say because she loved it, she was supporting people. And actually my take on it was that actually she needed the attention. And that's, informed by the fact that my dad's a psychologist. So I was always going to have possibly a different view than somebody like Philip or McQueen might have about why she was doing what she was doing. But until I had all of the pieces in place, until I spoke to everybody who'd known her entire life, I don't think I would have been able to see that for what it was. As a teenager, she was famous for taking off her clothes, not putting them on. She didn't dress outlandishly when she was 13 or 14, 15. She went to parties and then just would get drunk and do a little striptease for people.
Well, thank you so much for chatting to me today. It's been really great to hear about the journey across the 20 years that you've been doing this and doing it so successfully. And so thank you for coming. Thank you to the audience for watching. It's been a pleasure having you here. Please like, subscribe, review, and all those good things. We would love to hear who you'd like to see on the show. This is just as much about giving authors and artists a platform as it is about giving you what you want to watch. So we'd love to hear feedback and see you all next time. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you, Megan.